society in Japan if the account is not to their liking. So there's very, very few histories and very, very few memoirs, let alone of any Japanese in China. So again, this is a very, very gray area that we don't have. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give Chinese accounts of the August 15th, but they certainly deserve their own day. And again, I only have an hour, so we will go with the English sources we have here. I'll briefly mention some of the sources I'm using today. We have Ruth Barr's book, Ruth's Record, put together by Betty here. A book by, there's three accounts by foreign internees. Peggy Abkhazi's book, which I'll mention in a bit. Woman, where is she, Blair? She's right here. Yeah, Gudao Lone Islet by Margaret Blair. Enemy Subject, which is Peggy Abkhazi, the Lunghwa camp. Henry Pringle's Bridge House Survivor. He was a telephone company executive who was sent to the infamous Bridge House and survived. This was the headquarters of the Japanese Gestapo, known as the Kempeitai, and he was tortured and lived, and also has a very harrowing story I'll get to in a bit. Then one memoir by a Jewish refugee, Strange Haven, by Sigmund Tobias. Strangers Always, a Jewish family in wartime Shanghai, Rena Krasno. And one of the really good one I like, Stateless in Shanghai by Liliane Willlens. She is a Russian Jew who was able to how do you say it, Francify themselves. So she lived in the French Concession, went to the French school, and tells a lot from the French side of things. And I'll be able to talk briefly, of course, about Emperor Hirohito's speech, and then the reaction immediately of Shanghai Shek and of Chairman Mao Zedong. So let me begin. My first source is an excellent secondary source. One of the best books I've ever had is to refer to Captives of Empire by Dr. Greg Leck, a fantastic encyclopedia of all of the internment camps the Japanese had for allies in China. His mother was interned, and this gentleman, a veterinarian by profession, has written a book that any historian would be proud of, and we're very thankful to have a copy of it here. Dr. Leck has visited us several times, and I'll begin with his introduction. This is from chapter 24, entitled Liberation. By the end of 1944, conditions in Greater Shanghai reflected the desperate position the Japanese Empire found itself in. Building had ceased due to shortages of wood and iron and cement. Fuel oil was non-existent, leading to the use of charcoal-powered vehicles. Quinine and other drugs here were in short supply. Shipping had ceased, as did banking. In order to prevent speculation, with virtually no import and export trade, commodity prices skyrocket. Those who held stocks of goods preferred to hoard them against future increases in value that they would bring. The only coal reaching Shanghai came by rail or by small coast vessels. Virtually none was available to private parties. Rice was also scarce. None was reaching the city from Saigon, and the rice from the Yangtze Basin was reserved for the Japanese, leaving only broken rice, red rice, cargo rice, that it was called, available to the general public. Utility companies, due to the general inefficiency, a deliberate lack of cooperation, bordering on sabotage and squeeze, corruption, bribes, in all its forms, were being run at a steady loss by the Japanese. Dr. Leck continues. Refugee Jews from Hitler's Germany, numbering about 20,000, had been herded into Hongchu district in August of 1943. Crammed into a ghetto, but living alongside Chinese residents, some were allowed to work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., but conditions within the area were deplorable. No support whatsoever was received from the Japanese. Soviet and stateless Russians were very outspoken and commented freely on events in the European theater, but refrained from publishing or commenting anything on any news in the Far East. In Frenchtown, the French Concession, the French maintained a pro-Pétain Vichy stance. After the liberation of France, in 1944, they avoided declaring themselves on the side of the Allies so as not to antagonize the Japanese. The French Concession was administered by corrupt Japanese and Chinese puppets. Petty theft and robberies occurred continuously, and the Shanghai Municipal Police was now a hopeless, inefficient, and blatantly corrupt force. There was no belief in any possibility of a Japanese victory. Guerrillas were active all around Shanghai in the Pudong and Hongqiao areas. Within the city, terrorism and assassination continued. But the Japanese were determined to hold on. By the summer of 1945, trenches and rifle pits had been dug in most of the streets of downtown Shanghai. Barricades and fortifications were placed around major buildings. This is a quote from the Shanghai Times, which was a Japanese-run English language newspaper, and they reprinted the Mainichi from the Mainichi in Tokyo. Quote, "The rise in unison of the military, the officials, and the people is the very factor that will call forth the miracle of the Nippon race. Now is the very time for 100 million people, whether they be military, servicemen, government officials, or civilians, to join a general march, forfeiting all personal profit and desire for fame." Dr. Leck quoting a diary by Eric Schmidt, an internee, talking about the food situation in the internment camps. Eric Schmidt, May 25th, 1945. Quote, "No breakfast, lunch, tiffin, cabbage and beans, no supper, no rice arrived. The Japanese were not in any position to feed the camps. After a visit to Yangzhou internment camp, the Swiss consul, Emile Fontenelle, added a confidential addendum to his report stating that conditions had, quote, seriously deteriorated and that internees were facing serious hardships. Food supplies were dwindling, and by June 1945, only one meager meal was provided. This usually consisted of 1 ounce of meat, 3 to 4 ounces of vegetables, 1 medium potato, 1 small beet, and 12 ounces of poor quality bread. Many internees recall that during this period, this is March, April 1945, the entire daily ration consisted of 1 single beetroot. Sigmund Tobias, writing in Strange Haven, Jewish Childhood in Wartime Shanghai. By 1945, the refugees in the ghetto felt worn out by the war. Many people suffered from illnesses, but the doctors in refugee hospitals had little medication to treat the patients. Many refugees were taking meals in the emergency kitchens in the Heime. These were emergency kitchens and relief centers for the Jews set up in the late 30s. Heime. Or carrying, we're taking meals in the kitchens in the Heime or carrying food there to their rooms. Food had become so expensive that few people outside of the Jewish school, the yeshiva community, had enough to eat. It was common to see people hurrying home from the Heim kitchens carrying a small set of nested pots. I wondered if people hurried while carrying their meals so that the food would not get cold, or because they were ashamed of being forced to get their meals from the emergency kitchens. Allied air raids, from Greg Leck, now quoting several internees. Air raids on Shanghai were becoming common, with B-24s from American bases in China attacking targets in the city. David Scrimgeour recounted a November 16th, 1944 raid, which he viewed from the Pudong camp. The Pudong internment camp is now under all of the skyscrapers that you see on the Lijiazui side, so there's nothing left of that side. I'll have to go to the book here. At about 9:15, I got down to the shop in the morning. The air raid alert went. No precautionary was sounded, which is apparently the usual thing here when the planes are coming over Shanghai. And right enough, there they were, and right over the town before anyone knew it. I was in the yard behind the wall, and I got a fine view of them. Big 4-engine bombers, 2 against the wall, with two of them with an escort of 2 fighters. They were at great height and apparently indifferent to the anti-aircraft guns, whose shells were going off in all directions, and I couldn't see any bursts near the planes. They passed over. We could hear the explosions even after we'd lost sight of them in relays of 2. The same performance went on 4 times, and we did not get the all clear until the 1 o'clock. So we had an exciting morning. And of course, the whole camp was alive, looking after the planes, conjecturing where they were and what they would be bombing. In many camps, while the Japanese headed to their bomb shelters, internees would race to the roof or other vantage points, because as it was also terribly exciting, recorded one internee who saw her first United States Army Air Force bomber in November of 1944. Other internees were delighted to watch the fireworks. Afterwards, children and adults would pick up spent shrapnel and cartridges. The Japanese were not amused by such enthusiasm. After one such raid, 6 ash camp internees were taken to the administration offices and beaten with a bamboo stick. Internees remained undaunted, however. On January 20th of January 1945, a United States Army Air Force fighter sweep against the Lunghwa airdrome was cheered by Lunghwa internees who watched as P-51 Mustangs streaked across the compound at rooftop level to begin their strafing run. The next month, during a large raid on the airdrome lasting over 90 minutes, US Navy carrier-based dive bombers could be seen in operation by ash camp internees. By then, B-29s from Okinawa were also flying raids over the city. Air raid on the Jewish ghetto. And this is from Sigmund Tobias's account. We could usually see the American planes raiding missions as tiny dots high up in the sky, and sometimes heard distant explosions of bombs. We had little fear during the air raids because we assumed the Americans knew, knowing that Jewish refugees were there, but they would not bomb the ghetto, which had nothing of military value anyway. All of that changed after July 17. The ghetto was bombed that day and 31 refugees were killed. It was an enormous shock to all of us to have such a heavy bombardment of the ghetto when the end of the war was so close at hand. We had noticed that a building on Seward Road, occupied by the Japanese Army, had large rooftop antennas. And that building seemed to have been the major target of the air raid and was completely demolished. And most of the destruction in the ghetto fanned out from that area. We guessed afterwards that the building had housed a Japanese military radio station, which was true. I now switch to Liliane Willlens' book, Stateless in Shanghai. XMHA, the English radio station, now under Japanese management, continued to spew farcical lies about German and Japanese victories. In April of 1945, one piece of triumphant Japanese propaganda turned out to be true, namely that President Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, the cowardly enemy of Japan and Germany, had died. This very sad news was overshadowed by good news, though. The Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was found by partisans, shot, and hung by his heels. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, and the Allied leaders had accepted Germany's surrender. The staff of the German consulate in Shanghai, faithful to the end, held a memorial service for Hitler, attended by neutral diplomats and representatives of the countries in Asia still controlled by the Japanese. Okay, let's jump over to Margaret Blair's internee memoir, Lone Islet. From our higher window, we could see over the convent wall into the grounds of the Japanese hospital and barracks. At our new vantage point, my brother and I could see the details of what was happening across the road. We could see all the Japanese military hospital patients who were not confined to bed being drilled until some of them collapsed. The drill master shouted and kicked at the fallen men until they fainted or somehow managed to stand up again. These exercises took place twice a day. As soon as a man could stand, he was made to exercise. This way, my brother and I saw firsthand the brutalizing of Japanese troops, a policy that created a fighting force that behaved particularly cruelly to its victims. The camp radio, and several internment camps had radios, secret radios. the camp radio pull toy truck, it was in a child's toy, which was in full view of the Japanese at all times, came with us to Ningpo Road. From this, the prisoners had heard of the news of the surrender of Germany and the proclamation of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, on May 8th, 1945. The prisoners waited in some fear for the inevitable Japanese collapse. The adults asked themselves what these people, with their belief in committing suicide rather than being taken alive, would do with themselves and their prisoners. Staying with Margaret Blair. Mr. Robertson, the camp liaison's exceptional skills in communicating with the Japanese became crucial. Now his mission to get as many prisoners out of the war alive was becoming increasingly important. The food situation was dire, and their cash allowance bought less and less due to inflation. So the Swiss Consulate and International Red Cross, under Emile Fontenelle, took over and made bulk deliveries of food to all the camps in June and July, a move that averted starvation for those unable to obtain relief from friends outside. But August came with no further food relief. I should mention what they're referring to here is that you were allowed to have neutral friends or even Chinese buy food parcels for you in Shanghai, whatever was available, and send it to you in the camp. This was a lifeline for many people. Okay, now we go to Krasno Rena. Yes. Strangers Always, a Jewish family in wartime Shanghai. Again, she wasn't living in the ghetto with Mr. Tobias. Being an earlier refugee, she was still living in the French Concession with her family. July 1945. At night, Sydney visited us to share the latest news he heard on the shortwave radio. Thousands of leaflets had been dropped by US planes over 11 Japanese cities. The Americans threatened that Japan would be subject to unprecedented bombardment unless Allied surrender terms were accepted. The British also reported stories that the Japanese people were being warned by propagandists that handling the leaflets would, quote, rot the hands of those who touch them and blind the eyes of those who read them. One of today's English newspapers, probably the Shanghai Times, reprinted statements from the Tokyo's Mainichi reflecting Japan's determination to fight to the end, probably dragging with them into the abyss. This is Dr. Greg Leck again. The Japanese expected a United States or Allied offensive against Shanghai and the Chinese coast in the autumn, and there was one plan. But if the war was to last another 6 months, large numbers of internees would not survive. Many feared the war would be continued by holdouts in northern China and those in the Wenxian or Yangzhou Sea camps, and these were internment camps in the north of China, who felt stranded in a rural backwater, could see the Japanese hanging on through 1946. And what their armies in China would do was anyone's guess. Again, one rumor was the Japanese would make a last stand in North China and kill the internees. At Yangzhou camp, the Japanese formed the internee men into companies for the protection of the camp from bandits or communist units. Each unarmed company was allocated a section of the camp wall to, quote, defend, unquote, while the Japanese dug rifle pits 20 or 30 yards back from the walls. This would put the internees directly in the line of fire of the Japanese, and undoubtedly the result would, many of them would be killed if there was to be an attack, and in fact, not lost on the internees. All right, let's see, okay. Back to Liliane Willlens now. She's 18 at this time. Although there were still no indications that Japan was ready to surrender, Shanghailanders celebrated at parties, albeit without much food and drink, the end of Nazism, fascism, and the inevitable demise of the Japanese. On August 5th, 1945, I invited many of my classmates from the French school to my 18th birthday party at our home, where we sang God Save the Queen, God Save the King, and La Marseillaise instead of the Vichy French ode to Marshal Pétain we had sung for the last 4 years. We could all carry the tune of the American national anthem, but very few of us knew the words. We drank many toasts of ice water and tea to the Allies and to the end of Japanese occupation. Despite the empty shelves in the department stores, my guests brought me perfume, handkerchiefs, scarves, and flowers from their garden, for even during the war years, it was impolite to come empty-handed to a party. A few days after my birthday, we heard that the Japanese city Hiroshima had been devastated by a powerful American bomb that killed thousands upon thousands of inhabitants. Okay. This is an amazing piece of a news article, which I'd never seen before. It was in Krasno Rena's memoir, Strangers Always. August 9th, a disturbing article was reprinted this morning from the Tokyo Mainichi. Headline, attached to parachutes. A small number of enemy B-29s penetrated into Hiroshima on August 6th, shortly after 8 a.m., and dropped a number of explosive bombs, the result of which a considerable number of houses in the city were destroyed and fire broke out in various places. It seems the enemy dropped new type bombs attached to parachutes, which exploded in the air. Although the details are still under investigation, their explosive power cannot be made light of. And then Krasno writes, in spite of this rather laconic statement, news spread like wildfire in Shanghai that Hiroshima melted. Is our city next on the list? Already they learned the Japanese nickname for atomic bomb was Pikadon, which was the flash and then the shock wave. So Krasno writes next day, August 10th, about Nagasaki. Another Pikadon, this time in Nagasaki. The radio claims the damage is not as serious as in Hiroshima, in spite of the fact that Japan downplayed the effect of the first bomb. Puzzling rumors. One should wear white clothing because in Hiroshima, those in black were more seriously injured. As panic mounts, prices get steeper and steeper. Meat today costs 22,000 yuan, Chinese dollars, a pound, and one egg, 1,000. Here she makes a personal note. This is, again, Krasno Rena. Here we are at the very edge of a long-desired Allied total victory, and my reaction is depression. I sat on the edge of my bed and scribbled my last will and testament. Since I have nothing material to leave, I wrote an emotional statement to console my family, should they survive. Tobias Sigmund writes about the news as it was received in the Jewish ghetto. In early August, a one-paragraph news story in the Shanghai Jewish Chronicle announced that American forces had exploded a new type of bomb over Hiroshima using energy from splitting the atom. The announcement of the new bomb was followed by 2 to 3 days of severe wind, rain, and flooding. While such floods happen pretty often in Shanghai during the rainy season, the waves in the Huangpu were rolling so violently that the embankments along the harbor were no match for them, for the fury of the waters. 5 days later, we learned that Nagasaki had been destroyed by a second atomic bomb. Japanese determination. The Mainichi harps in again and again the weakness of the United States, the arch enemy of Japan. Among the points cited were the decline of American people's morale, anti-war sentiment, symbolized by the heroic American flyer Charles Lindbergh, who had campaigned against President Roosevelt, and mounting American casualties. According to Japanese press, their government's attitude towards the enemy offer of peace is mokusatsu, which is apparently difficult to translate, but approximates to ignore. Krasno wrote later, although the Japanese later claimed the expression mokusatsu implies there was room for negotiation, the Allies interpreted it as an outright rejection of their approach to peace. We now switch over to Peggy Abkhazi's excellent, Enemy Subject, which is all about Lunghwa. Her original name is Carter Pemberton, and she marries a man from the Caucasus, Georgia, after the war. A very interesting story about her. Very good diary. So this is in Lunghwa camp. We are seething with excitement since the news of Russia having declared war against our little jailers. It's the third dramatic surprise she has sprung on us since 1939. It was officially announced to us yesterday, but we all knew it the day before, the bamboo wireless being up to standard. She's referring to camp radios. When the bulletin came out, we were requested to make no demonstration, but as you can imagine, we are so excited and thrilled that none of us can settle down to anything. This must bring the end so much nearer, maybe only a matter of weeks now. Little does she know. Peggy Abkhazi, diary of August 12th. Then, after the evening meal, news ran around the camp that the commandant would make an official statement. So we all gathered in front of F Block in the steamingly hot but miraculously beautiful evening. And we stood and stood on our poor flat feet, and there was no sign of the commandant. At last, our attorney representative appeared and recited in an expressionless voice, "I'm sorry, but there's no good news for you. The Japanese put forward proposals to the Allies, and I think it will take some days for them to be considered. Meanwhile, fighting is going to go on, and camp life will continue as usual. But if ever a man didn't believe what he was saying, and if ever a crowd politely played ball, it was then." Rena Krasno is now quoting a Japanese newspaper, and this is War Minister Anami speaking after the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria. So the newspaper this morning published War Minister Anami's declaration, which fired our smoldering fears. And this is the minister talking. Quote, "The Soviet Union has finally taken up arms against this empire. Try as she may to disguise the facts by rhetoric, her aspirations to conquer and dominate Greater East Asia are obvious. In the face of this reality, we shall waste no words. The only thing for us is to fight doggedly to the end of this holy war and for the defense of our divine land. It is our firm belief that though it may mean chewing grass, eating dirt, and sleeping in the field, a resolute fight will surely reveal a way out of this desperate situation." And then Krasno wrote in her diary, "Are we to be crushed after all like helpless, meaningless bugs? Will the Japanese officers ever accept defeat? Will they not fight to the death to appease the souls of those already killed? Everyone says the next picadon will be dropped over Tokyo." I should note that Minister Anami was one of the members of the war cabinet that voted to keep fighting even after the Nagasaki bomb. And for several days, the war cabinet could reach no consensus. They finally asked the emperor for his input, and he was the tiebreaker. He was the one who said we should seek surrender terms. Unfortunately, the Allies were still vague about whether the monarchy could continue after the end of the war. And even Hirohisa, well, if they won't guarantee that, we can't keep the peace. So it was still touch and go for quite a couple of more days. Anami, when the surrender was finally made official, committed suicide. Back to Peggy Abkhazi listening to the radio in the Lunghwa camp. Diary, August 12th. "The latest bulletin is that San Francisco has broadcast that our terms have been accepted, accepting some fine points as who shall be in a government which will be agreeable to the United States and whether they can leave them their emperor's consolation. Our commandant has just sent around a message saying the camp will continue as usual until Allied authorities arrive to take over." At noon Tokyo time, this is from Greg Leck, Liberation. At noon Tokyo time on Wednesday, August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broadcast his acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Proclamation. In the guards' quarters at the Pudong camp across a narrow roadway, the guards, dressed in full uniform, with their swords and white gloves, stood with bowed heads and listened to the emperor's broadcast. Through a nail hole in the wall, George Laycock and an internee who spoke Japanese listened to the emperor's broadcast. The emperor's thin, high voice was heard, but speaking in a very formal court-style Japanese, which neither the guards nor the internee understood. While the translation was read, the guards stood as though frozen to the floor. It's at this time we're going to play the Emperor's Speech, which was remastered recently by the Japanese. It's a 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes, so I don't know if it's the full, but you can read along with the file that has been uploaded to you watching online, listening in online, and you may also, if you're here with your own copy, listen along. So hopefully this will work now. MP4.
Yeah, give me a second.
No problem.
I'm just gonna share the screen here.
Rena Krasno, writing in Stranger's Ally, always, stunned Shanghai landers listened in silence to rebroadcast of the Japanese Emperor's speech delivered the previous day in Tokyo on NHK. NHK would read his rescript to the Japanese people. After the strains of the Kimigayo, the Emperor's good and loyal subjects heard for the first time the voice of the crane. The message was clear, an admission of Japan's defeat at the highest level. One section of the Rescript. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual condition in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. An English version of a Tokyo Mainichi article appeared in today's Shanghai Times newspaper. This is in Rena Krasno's memoir. Quote, upon learning of the Imperial Rescript, we the subjects are filled with awe and cannot help weeping in consideration of our responsibility for causing His Majesty such grave concern. We have no words to express our apologies. Krasno wrote, I imagine millions of Japanese bowing to their emperor's voice in front of their radio sets, mesmerized by his words, subdued by the depth of their national calamity. Okay, we switch gears here to Greg Leck and then to Henry Pringle, Sir Bridge House survivor. He was one of a special category of Allied internees. He was suspected by the Japanese Kempeitai of actively helping the war effort. And as he was a telephone executive, he was accused of listening in to telephone conversations and spying on the Japanese. He was very lucky to survive. He and his class of prisoners was kept at Haifeng Road internment camp in Shanghai. And right before the end of the war, they were transferred to a rural camp near Peking called Fengtai. August 15th, at the large rail depot at Fengtai, 8 miles southwest of Beijing, over 300 political Allied internees from Shanghai had been housed in sweltering godowns, warehouses, since being abruptly transferred by rail in July. On the evening of August 11th, the internees heard such a terrific uproar in the Japanese quarters with much shouting and arguing continuing until the early morning. Pringle writes, a fanatical crowd were in favor of throwing gasoline on our building, setting light to it, and as we ran out, shooting us down. The rational crowd of guards, however, was against this, as they pointed out to the fanatical crowd, there were now 360 of us and only 18 to 20 real Japanese. The two factions were finally compromised by the idea of appealing to the 200 Taiwanese who were stationed in the camp as guards. They were in the Imperial Japanese Army, but they were Taiwanese, to join them. If they agreed, the plot was to be carried out, and if not, it was to be abandoned. Thank God the Taiwanese, knowing that the war was nearly over, decided against the idea, hence the removal of all their rifles the next day. The Japanese, notoriously one-minded and being very worried about the situation, forgot all about us. All right, we now go to the Chinese head of state, Shanghai Shek. His remarks were found in Rena, where is she? Yes, Rana Mitter's Chinese War with Japan. Excellent English language book on the subject. The next morning after Hirohito's speech, Shanghai Shek rose at his usual early hour. He wrote in his diary, "I thank God that the mercy he gave me was so great. Every word in Psalm number 9 is true in my experience. Psalm number 9 contains the lines, 'Thou hast destroyed the wicked. Thou hast put out their name forever and ever.'" Shang continued with his prayer, and while meditating, heard the recording of the Japanese surrender broadcast. Our faith in justice through black and hopeless days and 8 long years of struggle has today been rewarded, he declared. In the course of the speech, he gave special mention to 2 people, Jesus Christ and Sun Yat-sen. Solemnly, he declared, "The historic mission of our national revolution has last been fulfilled." After his radio broadcast, he cabled Mao Zedong, inviting him to come to Chongqing to talk about his grand plans. Mao replied that he would have Zhou Enlai represent him at the talks, but Chiang cabled back Mao himself should make the journey to the meeting that would decide the shape of China's post-war government. Mao Zedong did attend, but with the protection of the American ambassador. And he stayed in Chongqing for about 3 weeks as they held talks, but as you know, civil war was on the horizon. And Mao Zedong spoke to his meeting of cadres on August 13th, 1945 to give his opinion on the end of the war. And I'll just mention a few points here. This is Mao speaking. "These are days of tremendous change in the situation in the Far East. The surrender of Japanese imperialism is now a foregone conclusion. The decisive factor for Japan's surrender is the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. 1 million red troops are entering China's northeast. This force is irresistible. Japanese imperialism can no longer continue the fight. Chinese people's hard and bitter war of resistance is crowned with victory. At a historic stage, the war of resistance against Japan is now over." And then he continues with the dig on the atom bombs. "The Soviet Union has sent its troops. The Red Army has come to help the Chinese people drive out the aggressor. Such an event has never happened before in Chinese history. Its influence is immeasurable. The propaganda organs of the United States and Shanghai Shek hope to sweep away the Red Army's political influence with 2 atom bombs, but it can't be swept away. That isn't so easy. Can atom bombs decide wars? No, they cannot. Atom bombs could not make Japan surrender. Without the struggles waged by the people, atom bombs themselves would be of no avail." He goes on to pledge resistance to Shanghai Shek, and saying, "If Shanghai Shek wants to launch a countrywide civil war and his policy is set, we must be prepared for this." The civil war will break out again in October of 1946. All right, we're back at Fengtai with Harry Pringle's political prisoners who are still lucky to be alive. They didn't know the full story yet. The next morning, August 16th, reveille was sounded as usual, and we saw the Japanese and Taiwanese line up to do their usual koto to the emperor, after which they came over and we had the usual roll call. There was no sign of any end to the war. At 10 o'clock in the morning, however, Endo came over, and as I was near the gate, he asked me for the 2 camp representatives. He asked me where the 2 camp representatives were. I conducted him to their office, and with my flapping ears, I heard him say, "The Colonel and Lieutenant Honda request that you please come over to their office." C and W left our enclosure, and their progress was watched by everybody. We saw them go in and do the usual bow to the Colonel and Honda. Then we saw them invited to take seats! Exclamation. They were over there for about a half an hour, and when they finally rose, we noticed that they had dispensed with the usual bow. Endo preceded them out, and we saw him engaged in earnest conversation for a few minutes. Then they walked towards us, raised their hands, thumbs up. We knew that it was over. We were still alive. There was no cheering. Everyone just turned around and looked at each other. We were too overcome to demonstrate in any other way than to shake hands with each other and to say, thank God. Krasno Rena, now on Huaihai Road in the French Concession. After the news, my sister and I excitedly put on our favorite red dresses, trimmed with delicate lace, and went out to investigate what was happening on our main thoroughfare, Avenue Joffre. Hundreds of Shanghailanders had the same idea, and the large street was crowded with ecstatically happy, rowdy people. Strangers smiled at each other and shook hands and laughed. Victory for the Allies. Shanghai had survived. Okay, I'm going to invite Betty to come over and read a little bit from her mother's diary from the end of the war. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to use this opportunity to...
As you've heard, there were many rumors going around, and nobody knew what the Japanese would do when the last days came. My mother wrote that one small child said to another, "Have you heard? The war is over again." Because the war seemed to be over again and again. I personally can remember that nothing much happened, actually. It was very quiet. And this is what my mother wrote on Wednesday, August 15th. The Swiss took over the camps at noon, it being confirmed that the war is over. Great jubilation. Thanksgiving service at 7 p.m. out of doors. 6 flags were unfurled on top of F Block. American, Dutch, British, Chinese, Belgian, Russian. Entertainments on both roofs till midnight. Clear sky, bright moon. Perfect. That's what my mother wrote on the DJ Day 45 years ago, 75 years ago.
Betty will be available during the quick question and answer period. Okay, Peggy Abkhazi, speaking again in the same Lunghwa camp. Beginning today, August 15th, 16th, beginning today, we are allowed to go for walks in the surrounding countryside. I want to go alone for the first time, as it will be an extraordinary sensation to go out of those gates after nearly 2.5 years. This morning, country people crowded around the fence and gates with eggs, chickens, and melons for sale, or preferably exchanged for old clothes. Brisk bargaining went on, but soon the prices became exorbitant, and my worn-out rags stood no chance against the brand new Dire Need brand underwear some reckless souls had produced as payment. The water cart went into town for the usual water rations, but also laden with the first contingent of men going into town or the consulate to see if their offices are still standing or their homes. They'll be back tonight. Later, as I was writing the last night, amidst the noise of a hut full of visitors, to my surprise and delight, I heard my name called, and there was T.S. standing. I don't think you knew him, but he has been my wise and untiring outside contact, sending in monthly parcels and safeguarding the remaining valuables, papers, etc. I wonder if you can imagine what it feels like to have talked with someone from the outside world, and especially one so full of plans and about getting me out of this place as soon as possible. Okay, TS might have been a neutral or maybe a Chinese employee. I'm thinking a neutral, but again, this was someone who was kind of your lifeline, and he came to the camp immediately to see Peggy. Okay, I want to go to J.G. Ballard. I don't know how many of you are aware of J.G. Ballard, probably the finest surrealist in the English language, known mostly for his science fiction works, and halfway through his great stack of books, he decided to write Empire of the Sun about his time at Lunghwa camp, which is fictionalized, and internees who don't like the fictional parts are prone to complain about it, but he kind of shrugged it off, and it's an apocalyptic novel. It's a minor apocalypse. It's the end of the foreigner's world in Japan. And it was made into a movie by Steven Spielberg in 1991 with many scenes filmed here in Shanghai. However, Ballard goes straight to facts and talks about in a Times feature piece in the early 90s, The End of My War. And again, he was in G Block, a neighbor of Betty. People gathered silently at the open gates, peering at the dusty road to Shanghai. A few of the bolder men stepped out into the barbed wire. I joined them, but cautiously walked to a grave mound 200 yards away. I looked back at the camp, at the intense, crowded world that so long been my home. Freedom in the war's end seemed fraught with danger, like the silent sky. I ran back to the wire, glad to be within the safety of the camp again. As much as I might miss Lunghwa, I was keen to see Shanghai again and visit our house on Amherst Avenue. Most of the 2,000 internees remained in the camp, too tired to make their way on foot and without money or jobs to support them. Shanghai Shek's armies were far inland, and the nearest American forces were on the island of Okinawa. Meanwhile, the countryside around Lunghwa was a zone of danger roamed by undisciplined Japanese troops, destitute peasants, and gangs of leaderless soldiers of the Chinese puppet forces. It would be days before the Allied advance guard arrived and took control. The B-29s had returned and flew slowly over the camp at little more than 500 feet, bomb doors open. But instead, they were dropping food supplies, cartons of sea rations filled with unimaginable treasures, tins of Spam and Klim, packs of Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields, and bars of hard, gritty chocolate that flooded my mouth with an overpowering sweetness. The parachutes sailed over the camp, landing in nearby fields and canals, and parties of internees ran out to seize them from the Chinese peasants, forgetting that they too were Allied civilians. Unsettled by all this, I decided to walk to Shanghai. Did we lose it? I'm still on, okay. Unsettled by all this, I decided to walk to Shanghai. 3 days after Hirohito's broadcast, and without telling my parents, I made my way to the northern perimeter of the camp, beyond the old shower house, and climbed through the barbed wire. In front of me was a terrain of derelict canals and deserted villages. To my right, the Japanese military airfield lay between the camp and the broad arm of the Huangpu River. Lunghwa Pagoda, converted by the Japanese into a flak tower, rose in the humid August air. During the American raids, the pagoda had lit up like a Christmas tree, tracers streaming towards the low-flying P-51 Mustangs, but now its guns were silent and unmanned. Avoiding the airfield with its restless Japanese sentries, I climbed the embankment of the Hangzhou-Shanghai railway line and set off between the humming rails. Half an hour later, I approached a small wayside station where a platoon of Japanese soldiers squatted among their rifles and ammunition boxes, waiting for a train that would never come. When I was 20 yards away, I saw they'd taken a prisoner, a young Chinese in black trousers and white shirt. They had tied him to a post with telephone wire cut from the poles beside the tracks, and one of the soldiers was now slowly strangling him. The Chinese rolled his head as the wire tightened, singing to himself in a high voice. The other soldiers had lost interest in this dying man and watched me slowly walk up without comment, curiously eyeing my ragged khaki shorts and shirt. I wanted to tell them the war was over, but I scarcely believed it myself. And I knew that the war's end carried little meaning for these Japanese soldiers who caring nothing for their own lives, they cared nothing for the lives of others. Leaving the station, I walked along the railway line. The choking sing-song of the dying Chinese floated on the air as he sang himself towards his death. I've never forgotten that song, but at the time, regrettably, I accepted his casual murder as no more than one of the minor realities of the war. 2 hours later, exhausted and thirsty, I reached the western suburbs of Shanghai. At the end of Amherst Avenue, that's now Panyulu, I stopped at the house of my closest friends, the Kendall Wards, who were interned in another camp near Shanghai. Hoping to see them, I walked up to the steps of the open front door and gazed it through the sky at the sky above. The house was a brick shell. Everything had been stripped by the passing Chinese. Joists and floorboards, roof timbers, door frames, pipes, and electric cables had gone, leaving only the ghosts of the games we had played as children. A few hundred yards away was the Ballard house at 31 Amherst Avenue. The roof and windows were still attacked, but when I rang the doorbell, the door was opened by a young Chinese soldier in a puppet army uniform. "This is my house," I told him. He tried to bar my way with his rifle. When I pushed past him, he gave up, aware that for him too, the war was over. I stared at the silent rooms, which seemed strangely grand and formal after the shabby clutter of Lunghwa. Everything was in place: the carpets, furniture, bookshelves, the cooker, the large refrigerator, and the American-style kitchen. The house had been occupied by a general in the puppet army, and the war had ended too abruptly for him to steal its entire contents. I wandered through the airless house, trying to put 100 memories of my childhood into their right places. But I'd forgotten too much, and I felt like a stranger visiting myself. I climbed to my room on the top floor and lay on the bed, looking at the empty shelves where I kept my chum annuals and American comics, and at the rusty hooks in the ceiling where I had hung my model planes. Most of my mind was still in Lunghwa, but a small part of it had come home. All right, let me see if I can find our denouement here. Where's 36? I wanted to follow the format that Walter Kempowski used in his book. He ends right at the end of the war, the day of the end of the war in 36, what am I saying, 1945, and doesn't go into all of the aftermath. So we're at this moment where the Japanese are still there. They're standing at guard over the buildings. Chinese are walking up and shouting and spitting at them, but they're having no response. We're waiting for the Chinese nationalist troops to march in, which they do on August 26th. The surrender is signed September 2nd on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And then the first week of September, the American fleet rolls in, and thousands of American sailors, soldiers, servicemen, pockets full of dollars, make their own impact on Shanghai, which is worthy of another presentation such as this. So we've come to an end of our appointed hour, and Betty and I are available for questions. We can also hear the Emperor's speech if you like, and we'll throw it open for questions there.
Great, thank you so
We'll
much.
take questions from the people online. If you want a question, I guess you can type it in the chat box.
And you'll read it to me.
Sven, would you be able to
She's
tell us
speaking. We should be able to hear something. Okay, we've lost all the sound here.
about the Lunghwa?
Please repeat.
And the tour?
Sorry, we can hear you now.
We can hear you now. We were, yeah.
Okay, Sven, could you tell us a bit more about the Lunghwa camp and also the tour you have been leading?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Lunghwa was one of the 10 camps set up in 1943 to house the it ended up taking in about nearly 2,000 internees, mostly British subjects, wives of British men, and a smattering of Americans. There was also Belgians who were interned there, American merchant marine sailors, but it was specifically, it was mostly for internees with families. So there were children there, and there was also, they had a school, the Lunghwa Academy, where the kids were allowed to take classes with their intern teachers. Everyone from the schools that were here on December 8th, 1941 was interned, so that was the situation there. The school had been built in 1934. It had been a battlefield in 1937 between the Japanese and KMT forces. Several buildings were destroyed, but most of them were intact. These were given over to family billets, bunk beds and little areas they were given to. And then there were 3 wooden sheds, long wooden stables that they had for horses, which were single men and single women. The internees ran their own affairs. They had stockpiled medicine and food in the year 1942 before they were interned. And they pretty much, everyone had duties: kitchen, gardening, cleaning, running the privies, cleaning the rice. And the Japanese guards were actually consular police force. This was a Japanese police force which was in Shanghai to protect Japanese diplomatic property, but also had powers over Japanese citizens in Shanghai. And these were the guards, not regular Japanese army. And that was a good thing because other internment camps in China that were run by the Japanese army, specifically Stanley Camp in Hong Kong, had much more severe conditions, and several internees who were found to be working for the war effort were executed at Hong Kong Stanley Camp.
Great, thank you so
I
much.
I give tours. You may contact me through different ways. I usually give them on weekdays after 4 o'clock, but I'm also available on weekends. We have 6 of the original buildings still intact at the Lunghwa campsite, which is Shanghai Middle School, Shanghai Zhongshui, or Shanghai High School International Division, located next door to the Botanical Garden near South Shanghai Station.
Great, thank you so much. And since we have Betty Barr here, would like to ask her about her memories of the internment, the more than 2 years internment.
You can talk greatly. Sit down, sit down, sit down. You just turn it over to you. I'm just gonna.
Hello, Betty. So nice to see you. Thank you.
Talk about your impressions of the internment generally, what you remember most about it. Just, general statement.
I'm gonna switch microphone.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions? Any comments you have on your general internment during the 2 years you spent at Lunghwa? It's a big work topic.
Well, as I've often heard Sven say, in fact, Lunghwa was, in a way, you could call it a privileged camp, I think. I don't like the word concentration. Some people call it it was not a concentration camp, it was an internment camp. And the Japanese, in fact, called it a civil assembly center. So they had assembled the civilians for their safety. And I was a child, aged 10 to 12. So I remember clearly, especially going from our house. At the time, we were living on Nanjing Shilu, the yellow house, which is still there. And we had been given 2 long pieces of white paper to put on our door. And it said that this was now the property of the Imperial Japanese Army. So our internment was very highly organized by the Japanese and the British Residents Association. And so I can remember clearly the morning we left, we went out into the lane. My parents put the 2 long pieces of white paper on the door. Then we got into a pedicab, or 2 pedicabs. I went to the Columbia Country Club. That's it's now the country club again, I believe. It's been renovated. And we sat there a little while with a group of people. And finally, a group of 10 buses came to this club, and we all piled into these buses in a convoy. In our bus, there was no Japanese guard, so it was as if we were going off into the countryside on a kind of outing. And we went past Shijiahui, past the cathedral, out that way, past the Lunghwa Temple, and then we arrived at this school where I had never been before. And on our arrival, there were many people who had already been sent there earlier. As I said, it was highly organized. And they were there to welcome us. And Mr. Hayashi, as Sven has said, he himself had been interned in London because he was a diplomat. He was interned in the Savoy Hotel.
And then later on Isle of Man.
But anyway, he was a very kind person. He was a very good commandant. And so we stood there. I think he made a speech. I'm not quite sure. And then we were assigned our billets. And our family of 4 were in a room, which I think probably had been for 2 students. It was a dormitory building. It happened that we were given a corner room, just happened. But unfortunately, we were facing north and west. North is the coldest in winter, west is the hottest in summer. So, but anyway, it was a nice bright corner room. And my father was working in the kitchen. There were teams of men working in the kitchen. And I was very proud as a child that my father became the head of the kitchen. And this was a family joke, actually, because he couldn't boil an egg. But he rose to this position because he could be trusted. In those circumstances, there were people who would take a little extra meat or vegetable or something if they could. My father rose to this great position, manager of the kitchen, because he could be trusted. My mother also rose to a high position in the camp because we were organized like a little town. And there was a town council. And my mother later was, I think she was called the labor officer. Anyway, she assigned jobs for the women, which was not a popular thing to do, because everybody in the camp had to work. That was taken for granted. In fact, I read in her diary that there was one man who refused to work, and there was some kind of penalty given to him. I don't know what it was. But anyway, those were the rules. And then my brother and I went to the school, Lunghwa Academy, not just school, academy. And the very best teachers from the Shanghai schools were there. And after the war, Cambridge University accepted the exams which those teachers wrote for those teenage students. Those teenagers could go to Cambridge University. I think I better stop there.
Thank you, Betty.
Other questions? Or we can open up to
Any questions from the floor?
So from what I read, it seems that at least at the beginning of the 1937, when Shanghai was just formed, it seems that the Nazi Germans in Shanghai were actually sympathetic with the civilians here. They actually let a lot of people into their area. I read a story somewhere. So
you're maybe thinking of the German Consul General in Nanking, who had a safety area tried to help with the safety area for civilians in Nanking. But there was no such thing here in Shanghai, of course. Okay. Shanghai landers and Shanghai people knew that something horrible had happened up in Nanking. And in 1938, Japanese soldiers who had been taking pictures of what they'd been doing up in Shanghai brought their pictures to Shanghai to be developed. Shocked film store workers saw these things and made extra copies of them. And that's how the first word got out about the horrors of Nanking Massacre.
Any other questions?
I've got online Scott Laura Satterfield's very interesting comments. I'd like you all perhaps to share. Scott's just a moment. He has the comments here. He said actually many of the camp guards throughout Japan, China, and Southeast Asia were Formosa Taiwanese and Korean refugees held in poor regard by the Japanese military, thinking them lesser than Japanese. I'm wondering if Sven and Betty and other friends and colleagues in the library could share some reaction to this comment.
Yes, of course. There were Korean guards at Lunghwa in the Japanese consular force. Korea was a part of the Japanese Empire from 1905 on. It was formally annexed in 1910. Of course, the Japanese forced Koreans to join the army, or even in the more notorious episodes, forced women to become so-called comfort women and serve Japanese soldiers in military brothels. There were Koreans and Formosans who volunteered happily to serve Japan during the war. Of course, it was a source of salary too, and there may have been some levels of loyalty and patriotism to the Japanese Empire, but we still have, you know, bits to, it's difficult to measure that. Ballard wrote about the Korean Guards, saying that they were just as much prisoners as we were. And Betty remembers sometimes that the guards who came to visit the Belgian girls, right? You want to mention that?
There was a Belgian family opposite us who had 3 beautiful teenage daughters. And these Korean guards would come from time to time to visit them and show them their family photograph albums. You know, they were homesick teenagers. They made friends with the Belgian girls.
Can I say a few words about the
Go ahead.
Taiwanese soldiers?
Yeah, go ahead.
Who enlisted in the Imperial Army from 1953, because you were, that was a great enthusiasm among the Japanese youth, Taiwanese youth, because it was a status, an honorary status, because they had been, they were started to be treated as a full, the imperial subjects, and there were in total 200,000 Japanese, all men, enlisted in the Imperial Army, and among them 30,000 were killed. Mostly in the Pacific, some even in China stage, and their treatment after the war was a kind of a great irony, because they were defeated in the battlefield, but treated as allied victors.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
After the war, so they were very confused, sort of disoriented. And worse, when the Chiang Kai-shek's troops landed in Taiwan, they were treated as traitors. Yeah. So, so that generation had the most difficult, time for their life experience, and that resulted in much of the confusion and sort of nationalism, anti-nationalism, and all that.
Questions? Go ahead.
I have a
hang on, we have a comment. Wait. Yeah, go ahead.
A comment. There's probably many of you know this well-known book written about life in internment camps in Shanghai. It was also subject to the movie. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name.
It's Empire of the Sun. I've referenced it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so
that's Ballard's book.
A nice depiction of what life was like for those people.
It's 50% correct and 50% made up, but that part I read about Ballard, where the Japanese soldiers were torturing the Chinese, he makes that events like that happening in the camp, like the Japanese are brutalizing the Allied internees. He also has like everyone's dying like flies from malnutrition. That didn't happen either. The only people who died in the camp were a few people who couldn't get their insulin, who were diabetics, I believe, and I think. So conditions inside the camp were quite good, and no one was fighting over food, which he talks about in the camp. Go ahead.
Don't have a question.
Yeah, Don, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question here from Jane Zhang, I think, online, and she asked this very interesting question here. She asked here, if the United States was not dragged into the World War II and dropped 2 bombs in Japan, would World War II end in 1945?
Well, that's quite a what-if question. We cannot say that the Chinese Nationalist Army and the Communist Red Army could have possibly defeated the Japanese, although before the arrival of the Americans, they were getting aid through the Burma Road and backdoor through India. The Burma Road was eventually cut by the Japanese, in 1942. It'd be difficult. I would have to say that parts of Japan might still be here. It's tough. I can't even begin to think about that. As for the atomic bombs, it's a very controversial subject that's of much debate today. Ballard is of the opinion, and it's later in that essay I read, End of My War, that the atomic bomb saved the internees here in China, because another 3 months they either were run out of food, or the Americans were planning that offensive to land on the China coast. The Japanese had executed Allied prisoners on other Pacific islands when they thought the Americans were going to get near or possibly liberate them. And the fighting for the city of Manila, Philippines, was exceptionally tragic, because the Americans left the 20,000 Japanese naval garrison no way of escaping, no way of retreating. So they fought to the death and took as many Philippine civilians with them, and over 100,000 died. That could have easily happened to Shanghai.
All right. Any other questions from the attendees here? Okay. Don't think.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay.
The internment camps, what was the real purpose of setting up the internment camps? Was it just to control the foreigners?
It's a rule of war. If you go to war with someone, you have citizens from the enemy country living in your country. You have the right to intern them, just because, of course, they'd want to do anything to help their country win the war. And this is protocol. German, Italians, nationals were rounded up in Great Britain and in the United States. As we know, the Americans did intern Japanese American citizens who were actually loyal to the United States just based on their race. That's a tragedy, but they did receive some compensation and an apology, although it was decades later. A small number of pro-Nazi Germans and pro-fascist Italians were also interned in the United States. I should mention that the high-ranking diplomats and other officials from both countries were traded in the middle of the war on neutral cruise ships or Japanese cruise ships, depending on it. But how this was done is that there were lists, people stood in line, everyone wanted to get on these ships because you got back to your home country in the middle of the war rather than waiting to the end of the war. And it was set up through the Red Cross. These ships would have to broadcast their course, tell all the warring powers we're here. They have to shine lights on the side of their ship, big red crosses, this sort of stuff. And then they would have to meet in a neutral seaport, preferably Portuguese, which would either be Goa in India or Lourenço Marques, or Marques, which is in what is today Mozambique. And they'd have to arrive on exactly the same day, pull up to the dock, stern to stern. The adults wouldn't talk to each other, but the children were yelling at each other from the stern, like, how's the food on yours? Because they're kids, they don't care. It's a big adventure. And then for these neutrals that have been traded, these internees have been traded for each other, and they get a few days in the port and they're walking past each other in Lourenço Marques or go shopping, and then they get back on their boats and they go home. So that was an interesting interlude in the war. There was even a song about going to Lourenço Marques. Remember you talked about that? Everyone wanted to go, but not everyone could. And a few people jumped the queue, I think.
It wasn't just the family, there were quite a lot of people.
Yeah.
So in my mother's diary, it's quite a lot about who's going to be chosen, how they were going to get together.
Ruth's original diary is here. There's the book she actually wrote in 1943. You should put it with the dishes, maybe. And maybe you want to put the camera on the relics for the...
Oh, yeah. Okay, the relics here.
Yeah. We have some relics. Betty brought in the plates that she used during her camp period. There they are. And if you put them, there's the original diary her mother wrote in secretly from the Japanese. They would have confiscated it, right? The Japanese would have confiscated the diary if they found it.
They would have, yes.
Yeah, they would have.
Betty, you said that there was no shortage of food.
There
was?
They had just enough until the end of the war, until those last few months, just enough.
Less and less.
Yes.
Okay.
There was only one thing on the menu: rice, soup, or cracked wheat stew with whatever meat and vegetables came in that day. But if you were getting Red Cross parcels from someone in Shanghai, or you got one of the ones that came from Britain or America that came maybe once a year, then that was your extra food.
I was surprised that they allowed that. That
Yeah,
you could have kind of food delivery to the
Yes.
camp.
Well, the Japanese pilfered some
They
of it.
pilfered some
Yeah,
of
they
that,
pilfered
yeah,
some of it.
sure. Yeah.
And if I may, I'll just tell you a story about these dishes.
Yes,
And some
please.
years ago, the CCTV interviewed me in Beijing, and I took some of these, and I showed them on the TV program. And the next day, we came back to Shanghai. We had a phone call from Beijing, the National Museum.
Yes.
They wanted some. So we said yes, because I happen to have quite a few. My mother took them after the war to Scotland. She used them in her kitchen for years. And after my mother died, I was going to throw them out. My husband George said, "Oh no, bring them back to Shanghai." So since when they've taken on life of their own. So if you go to the National Museum in Beijing, you might see some
Wash
pictures.
them
My
in case somebody
goodness.
steals. In case somebody steals. I certainly would.
Still one.
Alright.
Yeah, but were these from your house that you brought to the camp, or they were given to you at the camp?
No,
But you brought them.
Yeah, because, as I think I've said several times, the internment was highly organized, and the British and American associations negotiated with the Japanese beforehand. Again, there were rumors in my mother's diaries, oh, we're going to go on this day or another day and so on. But anyway, it was very organized. And the people who went in earlier sent out messages about what to bring, what would be useful. So that was why we took these. And also we were allowed 4 parcels, but they didn't say anything about the size of the parcel. So my parents put down a rattan, a piece of rattan on the floor, put the bed on, and piled up some, it was a huge parcel. It was one parcel.
Are we at the end of our half an hour?
Yeah.
I'd like to just end with the last little bit from one source, Liliane's book, Stateless in Shanghai. And she writes in her memoir, the conclusion to World War II ended Japan's 13-year occupation and the 3.5-year occupation of Shanghai. Many Shanghailanders thought their former comfortable lifestyle would return, even without the benefit of extraterritoriality, which was signed away in 1943. The economy would certainly be stabilized and stabilized and brought under control. In August of 1945, I exchanged $1 for 100,000 Chinese yuan. Okay, I want to thank everyone who joined us today in person and online. It's so nice to have people come into the RAS library. This is what's available to read. We need people reading books and not from little electronic screens. That's what we need to do. You need to feel some paper in your hand. Our library is open to members technically between 10 and 10 every day, but if the parent organization is having a meeting, you can't come in, but you can go to the lounge. And librarians are here Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday from 2 to 6 on the weekdays and 2 to 5. And if you're a serious scholar, please make an appointment. We will open the collection for you. All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Particularly remarkable.